I moved into my new house with excitement, a fresh start in a quiet neighborhood where I could finally have the peace and stability I had been looking for. From the first day, I made a decision to follow every single rule in the HOA handbook. No exceptions. I knew the rules could feel strict, but I believed they were there to protect the neighborhood and maintain the sense of community that drew me in. I painted my house exactly according to the approved color palette, kept my lawn immaculately trimmed, and even invested in proper landscaping to ensure every flower and shrub met the guidelines. I cleaned my driveway regularly, ensured my trash bins were hidden from view, and double-checked all exterior modifications with the HOA to make sure nothing was out of line. For 10 years, I meticulously followed every rule, not because I wanted to be perfect, but because I valued the harmony and the promise of a peaceful home. Over those 10 years, I began to notice patterns. Some neighbors seemed to resent anyone who actually followed the rules. They would complain about trivial matters like how I had trimmed the bush that slightly overhung my driveway, or how my garden flowers were a touch brighter than approved. I brushed it off at first, thinking it was just human nature to have small disagreements, but over time, it started to feel targeted. I would hear whispers and see sideways glances at HOA meetings, small gestures that told me I was being watched closely. But I still didn't let it bother me. I believed in doing the right thing, and I continued following every guideline to the letter. Then came the first time I really noticed a shift. The HOA introduced a new rule about holiday decorations, specifying the type, timing, and even the location of lights and ornaments. I had always loved decorating for the holidays, but I followed the instructions, placing my decorations exactly where the rule allowed. My neighbors, however, began complaining, claiming that my display was too elaborate or distracting, despite meeting every requirement. At first, I thought it was just them being petty, but the complaints grew in volume, and the HOA seemed to start siding with them. Over the next few years, small infractions were pointed out that I hadn't even considered. They questioned the height of my lawn hedges, the style of my mailbox, and even the timing of my garden maintenance. I remained patient and meticulous, responding politely, correcting anything flagged, and keeping records of every communication. For 10 years, I stayed calm, respectful, and compliant, believing that if I followed every rule, no one could truly target me or hold anything against me, but people can push too far. The tipping point came when I decided to install a small, practical shed in my backyard for garden tools. I submitted the application months in advance, included all measurements, colors, and materials, and waited patiently for approval. The HOA initially seemed to approve it, and I went ahead with construction. When it was finished, I received a formal notice that my shed violated a newly implemented rule that was not in effect at the time I submitted my plans. They demanded I remove it immediately, threatening fines that would accumulate daily. That's when I realized that my decade of careful compliance meant nothing if they could change the rules after the fact. I had built my trust in the system, and now it felt like that trust was being used against me. I began reviewing every single HOA guideline, old notices, and board meeting minutes to see if there was any way they could justify their actions. They had crossed a line, one that couldn't be ignored. For 10 years, I had followed every instruction, every rule, every suggestion. And yet here I was facing a penalty that was unjust and entirely avoidable if they had only maintained consistency. In fairness, the more I investigated, the more I realized this wasn't an isolated incident. Other homeowners had also quietly faced shifting rules, late notices, and selective enforcement, but no one had the patience, the documentation, or the resolve to challenge it. That was my advantage. I had a decade of records, receipts, applications, and correspondence proving that I had always acted in good faith. I knew now that this wasn't just about a shed or a small violation. It was about principle, fairness, and accountability. I decided to confront the HOA formally, but I didn't want to do it aggressively. I knew the power dynamics, and I also knew that escalation could be risky. Instead, I prepared a detailed dossier, carefully organized with dates, photographs, email threads, and official documents. I outlined my adherence to every rule, my communication attempts, and the inconsistencies in the enforcement they were now attempting. I wanted to make it undeniable that after 10 years of compliance, they were trying to punish me unjustly. And there was no room for interpretation. What followed next was a series of meetings, calls, and written exchanges. At first, they tried to dismiss my concerns, arguing that rules change and enforcement is necessary. I remained calm and factual, refusing to argue emotionally or make threats. I pointed out that rules cannot retroactively punish a homeowner who followed existing regulations. I highlighted that this enforcement was selective and inconsistent, clearly targeting someone who had been meticulous for a decade. As the pressure increased, I realized the moment had arrived to leverage my documentation fully. I shared every detail publicly with the HOA board and copied all relevant members in writing. I remained polite, professional, and unyielding in the facts. I emphasized that any further attempts to force removal would have consequences, not just legally, but reputationally. For 10 years, I had been the model homeowner, and now the system was attempting to undo everything I had done. They couldn't undo my careful record-keeping, my transparency, or my compliance. That was untouchable. The tension in the room was palpable. For the first time, the board seemed unsure. They had underestimated the power of a homeowner who followed every rule faithfully. They had assumed compliance meant passivity, that I would quietly accept fines or removal orders. They had crossed a line that they could not undo. I had built a decade of credibility, patience, and meticulous attention, and suddenly, those qualities became my strongest defense. At this point, I realized something essential. Rules only have power when they are applied fairly. When compliance is ignored or manipulated for selective enforcement, it loses legitimacy. I had become the example that the HOA would remember, that a homeowner could follow every rule, every instruction, and still demand fairness. That lesson would echo far beyond my own property line, and that's when I knew the story had only just begun, because the fallout from this confrontation would shape not only my neighborhood, but the very way future homeowners would interact. With the HOA, I was ready to continue standing firm, armed not with anger, but with the uncheckable truth that a decade of integrity cannot be erased by arbitrary enforcement. The moment I realized the HOA was serious about forcing me to remove my shed, I also understood that I had to act quickly and strategically. This wasn't just about a small backyard structure anymore. It was about principle, fairness, and making sure that 10 years of perfect compliance didn't get wiped out in an instant. I knew that if I stayed passive, they would continue pushing, and eventually, other homeowners would see that compliance could be punished, not rewarded. That thought alone fueled my determination. I began documenting everything more rigorously than ever. I went back through 10 years of emails, letters, and notices, photographing every front yard, every modification, and every piece of correspondence that demonstrated my consistent compliance. I even collected the HOA's own meeting minutes, which revealed how rules had been changed without proper notification, sometimes retroactively affecting homeowners like me. It was painstaking work, but I knew every detail could be important. If the situation escalated further. As I prepared my case, I noticed subtle changes in the neighborhood. Neighbors who had previously been distant now approached me with caution, some with curiosity, others with quiet admiration. They had observed my patience and dedication for years, but had never seen anyone challenge the HOA so calmly yet firmly. Rumors began to circulate, whispers of my documentation, my readiness to fight for fairness, and how no one could easily intimidate me despite my quiet demeanor. The neighborhood was starting to take notice, and that awareness became another layer of protection. The HOA, on the other hand, seemed increasingly frustrated. Phone calls from board members came more frequently, some curt, some attempting to guilt me, others warning me about escalating fines. Each message was carefully saved, and each interaction was responded to with calm professionalism. I refused to engage emotionally, knowing that anger or rash reactions would only weaken my position. My goal was not to argue, but to make the facts undeniable. 10 years of following the rules had built a fortress of credibility, and I intended to use it. A turning point came during a scheduled board meeting. I attended in person, armed with my comprehensive binder of evidence. When I presented my case, I did not raise my voice, nor did I demand immediate apologies or concessions. I simply laid out the timeline, every rule I had followed, every letter I had submitted, and how the rules had shifted unexpectedly to target me. I included photographs, emails, and even receipts proving that I had paid all dues, filed all necessary applications, and remained fully compliant. The room was silent as I went through each point meticulously. Then came the subtle shift. One by one, board members began to exchange glances. I noticed that the confidence they had carried in previous confrontations was waning. They had assumed I would be intimidated or that I would quietly comply. The assumption was wrong. I had followed every rule for a decade, not because I was afraid, but because I respected the system. Now, with clarity and evidence, I was showing them that respect was not blind obedience. The rules could not be wielded selectively against someone who had done everything right. Despite the mounting pressure, I continued to maintain composure. I emphasized that my concern wasn't personal. I didn't want to punish the HOA or embarrass anyone. I wanted consistency, fairness, and adherence to the very principles they had supposedly been enforcing. My calm, factual approach contrasted sharply with the raised voices and defensiveness of the board members. For a moment, it felt like time had slowed. 10 years of patience and meticulousness were converging into one decisive moment. After I presented everything, the discussion turned into a debate. Some board members tried to justify the fines, claiming procedural loopholes and new rules. I countered each argument with documentation, showing exact dates and communications that proved my shed was approved under the rules at the time of application. Slowly, the room shifted from confrontation to uncertainty. My presence, my preparation, and my unwavering composure had disrupted their usual process. They realized that this wasn't a homeowner who could be brushed aside outside the meeting. Tension continued to rise. Neighbors watched from a distance, some concerned, others curious about how it would end. The HOA began sending additional notices, some containing veiled threats. I ignored them in the moment, instead carefully cataloging each new letter and ensuring my response remained calm and fact-based. Each attempt by them to escalate was recorded, and I knew that every attempt to bully or intimidate me would now serve as evidence of unfair treatment. One particularly tense day, a board member approached me personally. He tried to argue that my actions were provocative and that other homeowners were uncomfortable. I listened politely, acknowledging the statement without agreeing. I reiterated my point. Compliance had never been meant to provoke anyone. It was simply following the rules. The board's attempt to frame my diligence as provocation only reinforced my decision to stand firm. 10 years of careful, rule-abiding behavior could not be dismissed by subjective opinions. Over the next few weeks, I noticed subtle but meaningful shifts in HOA behavior. Enforcement became inconsistent. Some fines were delayed, some notices were ignored by other board members. Word spread quietly that a homeowner had challenged the HOA with meticulous evidence and calm persistence. I began receiving quiet messages of support from neighbors who had also felt unfairly targeted in the past, but had lacked the courage or documentation to speak up. It was becoming clear that my approach was not just protecting my own property, but also setting a precedent for others. During this time, I reflected on the lessons of the past decade. I realized that compliance alone is not enough. Understanding, documenting, and asserting your rights calmly are equally important. Patience builds credibility, but credibility alone must be coupled with clear evidence and strategic action to be effective. The HOA had assumed that fear and compliance could suppress a homeowner indefinitely, but they underestimated the power of thorough preparation and composure. The tension reached a climax when the HOA sent a final notice demanding immediate action. By this point, I was fully prepared. I had every email, letter, receipt, and photograph organized. I submitted a final response, carefully highlighting the timeline, inconsistencies, and prior approvals. One included notes on selective enforcement and emphasized my willingness to escalate further if necessary. But the message was clear. They had crossed a line that could not be undone. The first wave of uncertainty passed, but the aftermath was only beginning. I could see the realization on the faces of the board members. For the first time, they recognized that compliance and integrity could not be ignored or punished arbitrarily. 10 years of following every rule had created an unassailable position. No amount of arbitrary enforcement could erase a decade of documented, consistent behavior. The HOA had challenged me, but I had remained composed, factual, and unwavering, and as I walked away from that meeting, I felt a quiet sense of victory. Not arrogance, not gloating, but the profound satisfaction that fairness, preparation, and patience could overcome intimidation and selective enforcement. The story was far from over, but the foundation was now laid. I knew that from this point forward, I had the leverage, evidence, and credibility to protect not just my own home, but to inspire others in the neighborhood to stand firm when faced with arbitrary authority. After the confrontation at the HOA meeting, I knew the situation was far from over. The board seemed shaken, but I could feel their determination to regain control. They weren't used to being challenged, and they weren't about to let a single homeowner undermine their authority without a fight. I had prepared meticulously, but now I had to anticipate every possible tactic they could use to intimidate me or others into compliance. For the first time, I realized that winning this wasn't just about proving my point. It was about strategically managing the fallout and ensuring the neighborhood knew that selective enforcement could not go unchallenged. The following week, the HOA began a subtle campaign of pressure. Letters arrived in my mailbox with increased frequency, some threatening fines, some citing vague community complaints. I noticed the wording becoming increasingly formal, almost robotic, as if they were trying to intimidate me with bureaucratic language. Each notice was carefully documented, logged, and cross-referenced with my decade of compliance. Every communication I received was a piece of the puzzle, a chance to strengthen my position. I knew that any overreach on their part would serve to reinforce my argument and demonstrate their inconsistency. Neighbors started to notice the tension as well. Some would pass by my house and offer quiet words of support, while others kept their distance, wary of getting involved. I realized that the dynamic in the neighborhood was shifting. People had been silently frustrated with arbitrary enforcement for years, but seeing someone confront it directly opened their eyes. I became, unintentionally, a symbol of accountability. Even those who hadn't spoken out before began quietly documenting their own experiences with selective rules, gathering emails, receipts, and photographs. I realized that my actions were creating a ripple effect, empowering others to recognize that rules were not meant to be tools of punishment, but guides for fair community living. As the pressure from the HOA increased, I also began receiving unsolicited advice from neighbors and online forums. Some suggested ignoring the notices, some advised immediate legal action, and some recommended compromise. I took each piece of advice seriously, but I knew the key was to stay consistent, factual, and composed. I could not allow emotion or external pressure to cloud my judgment. My goal was not revenge. It was fairness, clarity, and principle. This mindset became my anchor, allowing me to navigate each interaction calmly. Even when the board attempted to provoke reactions, one afternoon, I received a particularly aggressive notice citing a minor technicality in the new rules. The wording implied that failure to comply immediately could result in daily fines, escalating quickly. Many homeowners in my position would have panicked, but I saw an opportunity. I carefully reviewed the rule, compared it to the date of my shed installation and prior approvals, and highlighted the inconsistency in my response. My letter back to the HOA was composed with precision, calm, professional, and irrefutable. I pointed out that the rule could not retroactively penalize homeowners who had submitted applications and received approvals in good faith. I also included references to prior instances where similar situations had been handled differently. By presenting the facts clearly and without anger, I forced the HOA to confront the reality of selective enforcement. The board's response was mixed. Some members reluctantly acknowledged the technicality, while others doubled down, insisting that the fines were justified. This internal division became my advantage. By staying composed and persistent, I highlighted the inconsistencies in their own enforcement policies, creating doubt among their ranks. I realized that the real power in this situation was documentation, patience, and unwavering adherence. To truth, every detail I had meticulously gathered over 10 years now gave me leverage that no argument or intimidation could override. As tensions escalated, I noticed subtle changes in the way the HOA communicated with other residents. Notices became more carefully worded, deadlines were extended, and meetings were scheduled with greater transparency. My actions had forced them to reconsider their usual approach. I was no longer just one homeowner. I had become a benchmark for accountability. They realized that any attempt to enforce arbitrary rules could now be met with meticulous documentation, public scrutiny, and potential legal consequences. I had shifted the balance of power without ever raising my voice or breaking the rules. I had always respected. The drama of this situation extended beyond formal communications. At neighborhood events and casual gatherings, subtle discussions took place. Some neighbors voiced admiration for my approach, while others expressed concern about the potential consequences of challenging authority. I listened quietly, acknowledging each perspective without judgment. I understood that fear and conformity often keep communities in check, and that breaking the pattern required courage, strategy, and an unwavering commitment to fairness. My goal was never to alienate anyone, but to show that adherence to rules and principles could coexist with assertiveness and accountability. During this period, I also began consulting legal and administrative resources to ensure that every step I took was grounded in law and HOA guidelines. I wanted to anticipate every possible counterargument. By cross-referencing my decade of compliance with current regulations, I ensured that any attempt by the board to challenge my actions would be met with undeniable evidence. My preparation became exhaustive, covering every possible angle, and in doing so I felt increasingly confident that no amount of bureaucratic pressure could undo 10 years of documented diligence. Then came the moment that changed everything. The HOA scheduled a public meeting to discuss ongoing violations, including mine. I attended with my binder of evidence, but I also brought a calm, composed presence that contrasted sharply with the tense, defensive demeanor of the board. As the discussion unfolded, I presented my case clearly, focusing on facts, dates, approvals, and consistent behavior. I emphasized that fairness and principle were paramount, and that retroactive enforcement undermined both trust and community harmony. I could see that their usual tactics of intimidation and selective rules were losing effect by the end of the meeting. It was clear that I had achieved a quiet but decisive victory. The board acknowledged the inconsistencies, agreed to review the fines, and even began revising procedures to prevent similar situations in the future. I didn't gloat or celebrate publicly. The victory was subtle but powerful. I had demonstrated that patience, meticulous preparation, and adherence to principle could overcome arbitrary authority. More importantly, I had shown the community that fairness, transparency, and consistency are non-negotiable values that should guide every decision. Reflecting on the experience, I realized that this conflict was never truly about a shed or fines. It was about respect, accountability, and the integrity of community governance. For 10 years, I had followed every rule, and for 10 years, I had demonstrated the value of compliance paired with awareness. Now, I had also shown the importance of standing firm when systems fail to uphold fairness. The lesson extended beyond my property line. It was a message to all homeowners, a reminder that rules exist to guide, not punish, and that integrity and patience can be more powerful than intimidation. And as I walked away from that meeting, I understood something essential. The HOA had crossed a line they could not undo. 10 years of dedication, compliance, and meticulous record-keeping had built a fortress of credibility around me, and that fortress was now unshakable. The situation was far from over in terms of ongoing adjustments and community dynamics. But I had secured a principle that would endure far longer than any temporary frustration or bureaucratic maneuver. The weeks following the public HOA meeting were tense, but the tide had clearly shifted. The board was no longer as confident or dismissive as they had been. Their usual tactics of selective enforcement and intimidation had lost their effectiveness. Because I had demonstrated a decade of meticulous compliance and calm, fact-based confrontation, the community was watching, and for the first time in years, it became clear that fairness and accountability could not be ignored. I felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that my perseverance and dedication had created a ripple effect far beyond my own property. As I moved through daily life, subtle changes became apparent. Notices from the HOA were now more carefully worded and issued with proper documentation. Deadlines were reasonable, and communication was transparent. The board seemed to understand that any overreach could now be scrutinized by a homeowner who had spent years documenting every interaction. Even my neighbors who had previously been skeptical or distant began to approach me, asking questions about their own situations, seeking advice, or simply expressing quiet support. It was a strange feeling to see how one person's patience and diligence could influence an entire neighborhood. I realized that the real impact of this experience wasn't just on me or my shed, it was on the culture of the community. Homeowners began paying closer attention to the rules, making sure to keep records of approvals, modifications, and correspondence. The HOA, in turn, started to enforce regulations more consistently and fairly because they knew that arbitrary or selective enforcement would no longer go unnoticed. A sense of accountability, long absent, was slowly being restored. I had set a precedent, and that precedent would continue to benefit the community for years to come. During this period, I also took time to reflect on the personal lessons I had learned. 10 years of strict compliance had taught me patience, attention to detail, and the importance of understanding systems deeply before acting. But the confrontation had taught me another vital lesson. Compliance alone is not enough when rules are applied unfairly or retroactively. Standing up calmly, documenting thoroughly, and asserting your rights with confidence and clarity are equally important. The combination of these habits not only protected my property, but also reinforced my own sense of integrity and self-respect. The board eventually withdrew the fines and formally acknowledged that my shed was compliant with the rules as they existed at the time of submission. They made slight adjustments to the regulations to prevent similar misunderstandings in the future, which meant that my stand had real, lasting consequences. I didn't seek to punish anyone, but I had achieved justice in a way that upheld principle over personal conflict. The message was clear: fairness cannot be optional, and meticulous compliance paired with courage can prevail against arbitrary authority. Neighbors began to approach me with their own concerns, asking how I had managed to remain calm and persuasive throughout the ordeal. I shared my approach openly: maintain detailed records, stay calm and factual, and never let emotion cloud your judgment. I explained that confrontation isn't about anger or aggression. It's about clarity, patience, and strategic communication. The lessons went beyond HOA rules. They applied to life, work, and every system where power dynamics and bureaucracy intersect with individual rights. Over time, the neighborhood culture began to shift. Homeowners were more vigilant, the HOA board more accountable, and the overall atmosphere more respectful. Compliance became a shared value, not a tool of intimidation. I felt a quiet sense of pride knowing that my decade of diligence, my careful record-keeping, and my calm confrontation had not only protected my own property, but had created a lasting positive influence on the community. What had started as a personal battle had become a lesson in integrity, persistence, and the importance of standing firm when faced with arbitrary authority. Looking back, I realized that the moment the HOA crossed that line, they set in motion a series of events they could not undo. 10 years of perfect compliance became my shield, my leverage, and ultimately my victory. It wasn't about stubbornness or pride, it was about principle. I have followed every rule, respected every guideline, and yet I was ready to assert my rights when fairness was compromised. That combination of diligence and courage created an outcome that benefited not only me, but also the community as a whole. Even now, years later, the impact of that confrontation continues to resonate. New homeowners hear the story and understand the importance of documentation, adherence to rules, and calm, confident assertion of rights. The HOA, now more careful in its enforcement, has a stronger sense of accountability, and the neighborhood functions with a renewed sense of fairness. What once seemed like a small backyard issue had transformed into a powerful lesson in principle, integrity, and the importance of standing up when necessary. The experience also changed me personally. I learned that patience is not passive, that compliance is not submission, and that courage can be quiet yet incredibly effective. I had maintained my dignity and integrity while confronting arbitrary authority, and in doing so, I discovered the power of thorough preparation, clear communication, and unwavering adherence to principle. It was a reminder that even in systems that seem rigid or unfair, individual action, grounded in evidence and calm reasoning, can produce meaningful change. Ultimately, this story is about more than a shed or fines. It is about the power of persistence, the importance of documentation, and the value of standing up for what is right, even when the odds seem stacked against you. It is a story of quiet triumph, of a decade of integrity meeting a moment of challenge, and of the profound impact one determined individual can have on a community. The HOA could attempt to enforce rules, impose fines, or intimidate homeowners, but they could not undo 10 years of careful compliance, nor could they erase the lessons learned through patient, principled action. And as I continue to live in that neighborhood, I do so with a sense of calm confidence. The shed remains, the rules are enforced fairly, and the community has grown stronger as a result. I know now that diligence, patience, and the courage to assert your rights are tools more powerful than any arbitrary rule. The moment the HOA crossed that line, they underestimated the strength of preparation and principle. They could attempt to enforce, threaten, or intimidate, but they could not undo what 10 years of careful, rule-abiding dedication had built. Credibility, integrity, and a lasting legacy of fairness that would endure far beyond any single confrontation.